Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
A couple of things. First of all, let's talk about the $4.6 billion expended over the last 6 years. And you indicated that 210,000 jobs were either retained or created, and I believe you answered a question previously that 20% of that overall number were jobs created. So that means about 42,000 jobs have been created. Of those jobs that were created, how many of them were temporary construction jobs, and how many of them were permanent jobs?
Yeah, they're not, the temporary construction jobs are not, and I don't believe we incentivize against the temporary construction jobs, so they're full-time jobs.
Okay, so the construction jobs and doing the bricks and mortars are not included in the 210,000 number here?
Right.
Okay. So of the jobs that were created, 42,000 roughly, are those all permanent jobs?
Say that again?
Of the jobs that were created, the 42,000, that doesn't include construction jobs.
Right.
Were they all permanent jobs?
Yes, permanent jobs, full-time jobs, yeah.
Okay. And of that number, are those positions still filled today, the 42,000?
Well, there's a lot more positions now filled, frankly, because the economy has grown so much, but I can't, of course, I cannot speak, of course, as you know, I cannot speak to every single job and if it's still filled, or if there's more jobs than they expected or fewer jobs than they expected over time, because they compete, and some companies succeed and some companies don't. If you look back over 5 years.
Sir, I understand that dynamic, but
so
you've made
that's
the claim
reality. That's the reality of the economy.
I understand that dynamic, but you made the claim that 42,000 jobs were created. That's the 20% number. So if you know those jobs were created, the question then is, you get reports from these companies, the question is, do you know if we still have 42,000 people working in those jobs?
Well, what I know is the vast majority of that is through tax credit programs that you don't get the tax credit unless you have the job. So when we spend the money, it's because you've created the job and the job exists. If you ask me 5 years later, the job, it's impossible to guarantee what the economy or what the company will do 10 and 15 years in the future. But we put together the program, we put together the program. Most of it is done, the vast majority, in a pay-for-performance mode.
So I'm not asking you to look at 15 years from now. I'm asking you to look at today, and if you have tax credit reports whenever they applied last time, then we should be able to get that number.
Yep.
The second point you made in answering other questions was ESD is an independent nonprofit status. With all due respect, I understand that, but we're talking about $4.6 billion of taxpayer dollars, whether you're talking tax credit or otherwise. These are taxpayer dollars. And whether those dollars are flowing through an independent nonprofit organization or they're flowing directly through a state agency, we owe it to our taxpayers to know how those dollars are being spent. So I and many of my colleagues are interested in making sure that we have the sufficient transparency, the sufficient accountability, and the oversight on these dollars. So you don't need to answer that. That's just the position I'm stating. As chair of the Commission on Skills Development and Career Education, I'd like to ask you a series of questions about the workforce development, because ultimately economic development is really about jobs for our families and jobs for our young people to stay here, which I think you agree with. So you answered the senator's questions regarding Buffalo. I'd like to have you explain to us what workforce development is happening in Rochester area, in particular in connection with photonics, to make sure that our urban youth are able to get into these jobs and other folks are able to get into these jobs.
Yeah, Rochester, and as you know, the head of Monroe Community College is now, co-chair of the regional council. They have a very large focus on workforce development. They have a very large focus on poverty reduction. I know there was a lot of funds allocated most recently from the URI to mentorship programs, to education programs, to workforce training programs. there's a very active council there, and we can go through their plan, but I think they've been very aggressive in funding workforce development initiatives. So, boy, the way that council is structured now, with Ann Kress as the co-chair.
I would just ask you, because ultimately economic development is about creating jobs, and ultimately there are populations and geographical areas in this state that really need a lot more focus on making sure that the workforce development programs are closely aligned with whatever economic development we do. I know we're doing some of that in Rochester. I would just like to see our efforts be expanded in that regard. Thank you.
Got it. I agree.